Amen. Well, I've taught out of Ezekiel before, and honestly, I'm just moved to do it again. I love Ezekiel. I love the way the chapter opens. I think it's great to refocus on this stuff periodically because it certainly shows the power of God, the grace of God, the relationship that God wants with people, the way God works with his faithful ones. It's just, Ezekiel is absolutely an amazing book. And it really helps to understand Ezekiel if we get off on the right foot, which means we've got to understand Ezekiel chapter 1. And if you think Ezekiel chapter 1 is about spaceships, you're getting off on the wrong foot. It's not about spaceships or extraterrestrials, little green men, or whatever. And frankly, this is an area where I think some of the modern versions have been bold to break away from the tradition that started back in the 1500s with, Tyndale and Wycliffe, and some of those were even earlier, and the Geneva Bible, and then the King James. And there was kind of a traditional trajectory, and then people felt, squeamish, if you will, about breaking that trajectory. But the fact of the matter is, the men and women back then didn't have the tools to properly understand the Hebrew text. The understanding of the Hebrew text has become better and better and better. In one of the very close cognate languages to Hebrew is Ugaritic. It was in the 1930s, that Ugaritic, that was basically the code was broken, if you will. We learned how to translate it. It took until the mid to late 40s before there was enough time to peer review that work and make sure we were on the right track. The first American Bible to take advantage of that was the Revised Standard Version of 1952. But there's a lot of words and thoughts here that I think we've got to get right. And one of the things that we'll note is, if you have the wrong idea about what you're dealing with, it's really impossible to translate the Hebrew. Sometimes it's impossible anyway, and we'll take a look at some of that as we go through Ezekiel. But so we're going to go to chapter 1, verse 1 of Ezekiel, and it says, "Now it happened in the 30th year." So it starts out, now it happened. Some of the versions are, it came to pass. That's okay. The Hebrew is actually an idiom here. And you'll see different versions translate the opening phrase in different ways. Some just start out in the 30th year because they recognize the idiom is somewhat kind of a jump start. But now it happened in the 30th year is certainly acceptable. In the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the Shabar Canal. Now, when it says the 30th year, this is the 30th year from the captivity of, or maybe the 30th year, I'm sorry, from the start of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month. In any case, Ezekiel is the most tightly dated of all the books in the Bible. And so much so that the scholars who study this stuff have pretty much agreed that this year here, the 30th year, the 4th month, the 5th day of the month, was July 31 of 593 BC. And you can rock that kind of dating all the way through Ezekiel. Now, this tells me something. If God can date Ezekiel so finely that, 2,500 years later, we can find the day this event occurred, then God could have told us when Jesus was born. He could have told us the day and the year and the month. He even could have told us the hour, and he didn't. And that tells me that God doesn't really want us elevating that specific day, kind of like Moses's brass serpent. Moses made this brass serpent back in Numbers to heal the people. By the time of Hezekiah, they were worshiping it. And so Hezekiah called it that brass thing and broke it up, broke it in pieces. And I can imagine what would happen if we knew the exact day that Christ was born. And I think God probably knew that too. He wants us to know and imitate the man, Jesus Christ, not focus on a day of his birth. But here's Ezekiel. This is going on July 31, 593 BC. And it says he was by the Shabar Canal. Now, again, older versions, they hadn't been to the area, and no archaeology had been done, and they didn't know a lot of the verbiage, the vocabulary. So in say, for example, the King James Version, it's called the River Shabar. It's not a river. It's a canal that was dug apparently as part of Nebuchadnezzar's desire to water the area so that plants would grow better and stuff like that. But it's a man-made canal. And so that's where Ezekiel was taken. I want to share my screen, give you an idea of where we are here. So you're looking at a map of the Middle East. Here's little Israel with the Dead Sea down here, Sea of Galilee. So this is little dinky Israel. Here's Nippur, this dot. I can make it right above my thumb, that thumb anyway. Anyway, there's Nippur. And Ezekiel was carried very close to Nippur. That's going to come up in a second too for another reason. But anyway, good old, 600-mile jaunt. Of course, you couldn't go across the desert. So they would go around across the Fertile Crescent. And this is what happened to Ezekiel. He was captured over here in Jerusalem and then carried as a captive by Nebuchadnezzar's army over here, and different people were scattered around, and Ezekiel happened to be placed by Nippur. So that's what happened to Ezekiel. So it says, by the Shabar Canal that the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. Verse 2, in the 5th month, which was the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's captivity. And we can learn about King Jehoiachin's captivity from both Chronicles and Kings. It's worth taking a quick look at 2 Kings 24, so we get a little bit of the history of what's going on here. So let's go to 2 Kings chapter 24 and starting in verse 8. This is Jehoiachin. It says he was 18 years old when he began to reign. Now, the reason he began to reign at 18 years old is because the previous king had rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar and had been carried off. So he was kind of forced into the kingship. He's only 18 years old, young, brash, unwise. Verse 8, he's 18 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 3 months. Didn't do such a good job. Nebuchadnezzar's big and powerful. He was the big dog on the planet at that time. And what Jehoiachin did angered him greatly. And, you just don't go around kicking, the big dog unless you're prepared for a good fight. So he only reigned for 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. Verse 9, he did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, just like all the evil that his fathers, his ancestors had done. And so verse 10, because of the evil and because of what Jehoiachin did in the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar, at that time the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem. The city came under siege. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. Verse 12, and Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out and surrendered to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his leaders and his officers. And the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. And he carried out from there all the treasures of the house of Yahweh. Nebuchadnezzar took all the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the utensils of gold in Yahweh's temple that Solomon, king of Israel, had made. That's an interesting historical note, because there were people this is the end of the history of Judah. And so there were other attacks upon Jerusalem, like, for example, of Pharaoh Necho earlier in Kings, where it says that Necho took the gold things that Solomon had made. And what this tells you is every time the city would be sieged, priests would run in and hide things. And then as soon as the city would get back on its feet, these things would mysteriously reappear. So even though Jerusalem had been sacked a couple times between Solomon and now, they still had some stuff left over, utensils of gold that Solomon had made. And then 14, he, Nebuchadnezzar, exiled all Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. No one remained except the poorest of the people of the land. And of course, one of those people that got exiled was Ezekiel, and he got carried away. So let's go back to Ezekiel chapter 1. And it says, he's in the 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. The word of Yahweh came expressly to Ezekiel the priest. And that's important to know, because Ezekiel's going to get a lot of revelation that's related to the priesthood. God's going to show him what's going on at the temple in Jerusalem and why eventually God's got to leave it and it's going to be burned to the ground. God is going to give Ezekiel multiple chapters of what the temple is going to look like in the millennial kingdom, starting in Ezekiel 40 and going through Ezekiel 48, 9 chapters of details about the temple in Jerusalem in the millennial time, also about what Jerusalem itself is going to look like, how big the city is going to be, and it's going to be on the south side of the Mount Zion, just like it is today. It's south of the top of Mount Zion. Even today, the city of David is. And then he also gave Ezekiel what the layout of the tribes are going to be in the millennial kingdom. So as a priest, Ezekiel got a lot of information that is relevant to priests. So the word came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Shebar Canal. And the hand of Yahweh was on him there. Now that's kind of a summary statement. So now this is going to tell you, it's going to develop how this happened. So you can see Ezekiel's there somewhere around Nippur by the Shebar Canal. Verse 4, I looked and behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud. Now it's intriguing that as you go through the scripture, if you understand the cultural and historical background, one of the things that God regularly does is he shows up in a way that challenges the local gods. Like, for example, when Elijah the prophet faced off against the prophets of Baal, then Baal was the storm god. He was a Canaanite storm god. And how does God face off against the Canaanite storm god? He says, there's not going to be rain or dew for years except by my word. And there wasn't any rain for over 3 years. So God showed that the real storm god, in that case, was him. He was the real God can control the weather. Here in Nippur was the ancestral Sumerian home of the storm god of the area, whose name was Enlil, Enlil. And Enlil was the Sumerian storm god whose hometown was Nippur. So Ezekiel is right outside of there. And how is God going to show up? He's going to show up as the real storm god. He's going to make sure that people understand he's the real God. So he looks and the stormy wind is coming out of the north. And you could see, I can just imagine Ezekiel, and he's there and he's watching, and it's kind of flat in that area because you're getting into the plain that runs into the Persian Gulf thing. Ezekiel's kind of looking across the landscape and looks like there's one of those thunderstorms out there, kind of cloudy and stuff like that. But it doesn't quite look normal, like it's quite small. And actually it's quite bright. And actually it's coming right at me at a relatively high rate of speed. And you can just see Ezekiel, when his mind is working like this computer, putting this stuff together and going, what in the world is going on? And then as this thing comes into focus, it's a great cloud with fire flashing back and forth and a brightness all around it. And out of the center of it gleamed something like the glow of gleaming amber. And amber is this kind of gold yellow stuff, and it's just kind of like gleaming amber, gleaming fire, if you will, out of the midst of fire. And what Ezekiel is going to do, and what we're going to discover here in these next verses, is that this is God's chariot throne. And this is what God rides when he travels. And it's got cherubim that have fleet-footed feet, and it also wings so they can fly, they can run. The chariot throne has wheels. And of course, because God's sitting on the chariot throne, then it's surrounded by God's glory, which, by the way, is monstrously difficult to describe. And we'll run into things as we develop the teaching, and you'll see it's described as a bright cloud, it's described as a cloud, it's described as a dark cloud. It's like, wait a minute, how can it be a bright cloud and a dark cloud at the same time? If you understand that it's not really dark in the sense that you and I think of dark, meaning like, I see some squares on the screen that are like blackish. It's dark in the sense that you can't see through it. So you've got this cloud that you can't see through. And in one breath, you're going to describe it as bright. But in another sense, it's like it's not translucent. It's dark. You can't see in it. So there's this reality that's occurring that's incredibly hard to describe in fleshly words, because this is the very presence of God, and the presence of God radiates a glory that's so bright and so thick that it's the glory of God, but it's described as a cloud because they didn't know how else to describe it. I mean, it looked from a distance like a cloud, but it's this incredibly brilliant, deep, and it's not translucent. It's what would you call it? It's like a wall of white, and so he's trying to describe this reality. And so he says, there's this stormy wind. It's coming out of the north. It's a great cloud with fire. It's flashing back and forth, and there's a brightness all around it. And then out of the center of it gleamed something like the glow of gleaming amber. It's like, in the center of this thing, it was like a goldy gleam thing out of the midst of the fire. And then he says, and from the midst of it came what looked like 4 living creatures. Okay, yeah, well, they're definitely alive. Haven't seen anything quite like them on earth. Going to do my best to describe them. This is Ezekiel. He says, well, okay, this was their appearance. He says they had human form. But then, of course, as he describes them, it's like, what? I haven't ever seen a human like that. But at least we know they're humanoid in their form. Verse 6, but each one had 4 faces. Oh, that's cute. So now we get to learn more about these guys. Each one had 4 wings. Verse 7, their legs were straight legs. Okay, that's like you and me. We stand up straight. Got it. They did have a humanoid form. Their legs were straight legs. And then it could be a but or an and, but each one had 4 wings. They had human form. Each one had 4 faces. Each one had 4 wings. Their legs were straight legs. The soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot. And you guys have all seen, or maybe not close up, but certainly at a zoo or at least in movies and stuff, how a cow's hoof or a calf's hoof, it's got that real hard hoof. And boy, if they want to spur the earth and get going, they can really do it. And so one of the things this is telling us, less about the shape of the hoof than the fact it's preparing you for the fact that these guys can really get up and go if they need to. So it says their soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot, but they gleamed like burnished bronze. So these cherubim, they shone, they just radiated. Verse 8, they had human hands under their wings on the four sides. Now, we don't want to get the idea that they had their side, and then they had wings, and then they had these little bitty hands sticking out. The whole idea was that they would have arms attached to those hands. So now you've got this kind of wild looking creature, looks like a man, except where the head is, there's four faces, one on each side, front, back, and each side had a different face. It's got four wings, but under the wings, there are these arms with hands. So this is quite a intimidating looking creature, to say the least. So they had hands under their wings on the four sides, and the four of them had their faces and their wings thus, or this way, verse 9. Their wings touched one another. Now that tells you that this chariot throne was not gigantic. And when we read Ezekiel and we see what it can do and how it can fit between the temple and the altar and that kind of thing, it's not like this chariot throne is hundreds of yards wide. It's a little thing, maybe 25 feet, 30 feet. The Bible doesn't exactly describe it, but it's not gigantic. And that's important to know. And that these wings then of the cherubim, they can touch each other. So their wings touched one another. Then verse 9, they did not turn when they moved. Each one went straight forward. I wrestle with this because, the way I drive anyway on the road, the fastest way to some places on a road is not always a straight line. You don't always go just south and then just west and then just north. Sometimes you kind of make curves and stuff like that. And I think it's a reflection of God's created order that he set up his chariot throne, that it moves in straight angles. At least that's the way I understand the text. So it says they didn't turn when they moved. Each one went straight forward. Well, if you've got a face in each direction, you can go left, right, forward, or back. So you got it all covered. And then verse 10, as for the form of their faces, they had the face of a man in front. So when you're standing there looking at the cherubim, you're looking at a human face. And then it says, and the four of them had the face of a lion on the right side. Now this would be their right side, because the right side was the hand of blessing. As you're looking at this human face, you see the face of a lion on your left. But as this creature is looking at you, the face of the lion is on the right side. And I think that's very powerful, because Christ, the lion, of course, symbolic in a way of Christ, the Lion of Judah, and the fact that Christ would be on God's right hand, and in the face of the lion is on the right side. And I think that's very powerful. So he's got the face of a lion on the right side. The four of them had the face of an ox on the left side. The four of them also had the face of an eagle that's facing backwards. And what's the significance of these creatures? Well, the lion is the king of beasts, equipped for the fight, a sign of God's righteousness and judgment. The ox is both the strongest domestic animal, and also fertility and helpfulness, stability. So that's the ox. And of course, the human, of course, is the pinnacle of God's creation. So that's mentioned first. And then the eagle in the back, the eagle is known as the king of the birds. He's the most powerful of the birds, the most majestic of the birds. So you have these four very meaningful, very powerful faces: a human face, a lion face, an ox face, and an eagle face. And so these creatures, these cherubim, have that. Verse 11, such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward. Each creature had two wings that touched the wing of another. In other words, as they spread out their wings, and two wings covered its body. And that's kind of interesting, because I think there's a gesture of modesty here, because if you and I were to look at these creatures, they are so powerful, so majestic, so imposing, so strong, that you would tend to be drawn to them and some of the glory might shift from God down to them because you're so fascinated with them, and they cover themselves up with the wings. And I believe, and there's no verse that says this. This is just from my study and my supposition, so you can take that for what it is. But that what they're doing is they're covering their glory, their strength, and their power with their wings in order to transfer glory to God. So as I've prayed about this and studied this now for years, that's the conclusion I've come to. So they cover their body. Verse 12, each creature moved straight forward. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went. They did not turn when they went. So if God said, go east, there they went. If he said, go south, there they went. Verse 13, as for the form of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches. You know, these guys, they were powerful and they just glowed. By the way, I need to say something about this too, is that, you know, the devil is always picking at God. Now, you know how the devil picks at us. And sometimes we can let that get the better of us, you know, just pick. And pretty soon you lose your cool and you drift into sin. You think about it. Okay. There was a good way to do this. I'd show it to you. I have a picture I inherited from my grandfather on my wall that has a kind of a religious theme to it. It's actually Roman Catholic, I think. But anyway, it's got a picture of two cherubs. And if you know what a cherub is a chubby baby. Now, there's no way that the devil can beat a cherubim in a fight. God created them to be his protective creatures. They surround him. They are around his throne. They protect him. They protected the Garden of Eden. You know, they are incredibly powerful beasts. And the devil can't take them on in a head-to-head, so he doesn't try. Instead, he just defines cherub as a little chubby baby with tiny wings. You know? So it's like, I'm just going to make fun of him. I can't beat him in a fight, so I'm going to make fun of him. If we take that home to our lives so many times, don't let Satan cause you to lose your cool by pick. It's just his way. You know, we breathe, we pray, we speak in tongues, we calm down, and he can't get to us. So these things, they move back and forth. I'll go back to verse 13. As for the form of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches. The fire moved back and forth between the living creatures. It's almost like, see, imagine you were trying to describe, like if there was an electricity in there, where the electric current is just flowing and glowing, and you're trying to describe that in Ezekiel's lifetime. How would you describe it? You know, it would be like this. It'd be like, well, it's this fire that went back and forth between the living creatures. It's almost like a gigantic electric field or something, you know, with this and going around. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. That makes perfect sense in that situation, that there'd be the electric, the lightning with its flash and, you know, the tremendous heat and stuff. Verse 14, the living creatures moved backward and forward as quickly as flashes of lightning. Again, think about now, God is creating these creatures to be able to transport him and to protect him. So it makes perfect sense that they would be literally, like we say, fast as greased lightning, because that's basically what these guys were. Verse 15, now as I looked at the living creatures, I saw one wheel on the ground beside the living creatures. It's kind of like we can almost translate that noticed. I mean, he's so awe-inspired by these creatures, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, there's a wheel there too. And so he looks at this wheel, and it says, oh, I saw one wheel on the ground beside the living creature. And it's like, oh, they've all got wheels beside them. One wheel for each of the four of them. So now you've got, when the chariot throne of God needs to fly, these guys kick up their wings and go. And when it lands on the ground, between them spurring the ground with their calf feet and rolling it along on wheels, this thing can fly in the air, or it can fly along the ground at tremendous speed. And so verse 16, the appearance of the wheels in their construction was like the gleam of beryl, and the four of them had the same form. And their appearance and their construction was as if one wheel was inside another wheel, which I confess I've never been able to figure out exactly what that looks like, and it may have something to do with the fact that the wheels could go in any direction, just like the cherubim could go. But I don't know exactly how you would depict that in if you were to try to draw it or something. It's verse 17. When they moved, they went in their four directions. They did not turn when they went. As for their rims, verse 18, they were high and awe-inspiring. And awe-inspiring is one of the two ways you can go with this, because the actual Hebrew word is dread. It's a step up from fear. Yare is the standard word for fear, and it's not that. This is a step up. So you can go into the positive and say these wheels are awe-inspiring, or you can say the wheels had such an incredible and gripping, it was such an incredible gripping experience to see them that it was actually frightening. Some of the older versions say that it was dreadful, but some of the more modern translations will go frightening or terrifying. So it's interesting as you read the various versions on this verse, some will go with the wheels are awesome or awe-inspiring, and some will go with the wheels are frightening or terrifying. The Hebrew word can be used either way. And frankly, I think there's a little bit of, it's awe-inspiring, but also at the same time, you're sitting there looking at the raw power of God, these cherubim and these wheels, and you're like, it just would take your breath away. So I get the two sides of this. And then the last part is very strange. It says in the Hebrew, it uses the word ayin, which is eye, but the word ayin means has a whole raft of meanings. And so what you usually get is the wheels had eyes all around. Well, the wheels don't have eyes in the sense that they're alive. They're not alive. If you went with eyes, you could, for example, the spring, the water that comes out of the ground is a spring. In Hebrew, that's the same word. It's an ayin. It's a focus point. It could be that there are glowing gems all the way around, but the same basic word is used so many times in this chapter. For example, go back to verse 4. Out of the center of it gleamed something like the glow of gleaming amber. That's the same word, same basic root word. Verse 7, the feet gleamed like burnished bronze. Same word, same basic root word. Verse 16, the appearance of the wheels was like the gleam of beryl. Same root word. And that's the same as in here in verse 18, where all of a sudden they translated I. They translated I because it's a plural in verse 18 and singular in other places. But the fact of the matter is that it may be that they had gems that gleamed all around. That would fit kind of God's creation. Or it could be simply that they gleam all around. Verse 22, it's translated glittering. If we want to go to chapter 10, Ezekiel chapter 10, please, verse 9. And it's going to describe this again. And it says, I look and behold, there were four wheels beside the cherubim, one wheel beside one cherub. And the appearance of the wheels was like the gleam of beryl. Same word. So it's misleading to translate this eyes because we think of eyes as the organ that you see with. And that's not what's going on here. It's not that the wheels somehow were looking around all the time. It's that they either had gemstones that focused your attention or they gleamed. I think the gleaming is the right idea. So verse 18, as for their rims, they were high and awe-inspiring, and the rims of the four of them gleamed all the way around. Verse 19, when the creatures moved, the wheels went beside him. And when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, which they did with their wings, then of course they picked up the whole Chariot-throne and took it with them. Verse 20, wherever the Spirit wanted to go, there they would go. I didn't pick this up in verse 12, but we see the same thing. Ezekiel is one of the few places in the Old Testament where God is simply called the Spirit. And we know that for many verses, God is holy. And from verses like these, God is spirit. So we can understand why one of the monikers, one of the names for God, if you will, the appellations for God, is the Holy Spirit. So God has a number of different names. In Ezekiel, he's called Spirit. And here we see him guiding his chariot throne. I mean, he's God, he's going to give them information. Verse 20, wherever the Spirit wanted to go, there they would go. And the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of the living creatures is in the wheels, meaning it's not in them in the sense of living in them, but it's in them in the sense that it works with them. So the spirit of the living creatures then is at work in the wheels so that they work as one machine. Verse 21, when those cherubim moved, these wheels went. And when those stopped, these stopped. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up beside them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels, was working along with them. So now what you've got is you've got a description now of this throne of God, and now you're going to get more detail about that. And again, the translation comes from newer work, newer lexical work, newer archaeology. There's no way in the world you can read the Geneva Bible, the King James Bible, the American Standard Version, any of the older versions, and get the truth of what's going on here. It came out as a later development as we understood more about the Hebrew language, because it says in verse 22, over the head of the living creatures, of course, that's the cherubim, there was something like a platform. And that's very important. I think the King James may read firmament or something like that. And then you end up trying to get this throne happening at the end of the universe or whatever. That's not what's going on here in the Hebrew. You know, you've got these cherubim and they're like the engine. And then over them, somehow suspended above them or held up by them in some way, and maybe that's the arms and hands thing, was this platform. And it was glittering awesomely like crystal. And again, there's your same word, ion, for eye, but here it's glittering or maybe gleaming awesomely like crystal that was spread out over their heads above them. So you've got these four cherubim, they've got four wings, they've got hands, they've got feet with hooves like calves so they can run like crazy. There are these wheels, and then directly above them, there's this platform. And it's glittering. Verse 23, and under the platform, their wings were stretched out straight toward one another. Each one also had two wings covering its body on the one side and on the other. So they're covering their body again. The platform, the chariot throne has stopped. So their wings are down. They're covering their body. Verse 24, when they went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of mighty waters, like the voice of the Almighty, a sound of commotion like the sound of an army. In other words, when these guys powered up their four wings apiece and God said move, it made a sound. And I got a kick out of taking a study of this, and like the sound of mighty waters. And I was thinking, you know, Ezekiel would not have heard the sound of mighty waters unless he went to the Mediterranean Sea, because there's no rivers, or the Sea of Galilee doesn't produce a sound like mighty waters. So he would have had to have either visited the Mediterranean Sea, or perhaps on his journey as the army of Nebuchadnezzar was carrying him from the Jerusalem area across to Nippur, that they would have crossed some rivers, particularly in Syria. Syria may have had experience with the Tigris, more effectively, actually more accurately, the Euphrates River, as they went on their journey to Nippur. But it was kind of interesting when I read this. I thought, where would Ezekiel have heard mighty waters? Could very easily been the sound of the Euphrates River. But you can see here just the power of them when they got moving, and then whenever they stopped, they let down their wings. So here's Ezekiel, and what you've got is he's standing there by the Shibar Canal, and he sees the storm thing. And then as it gets closer, he sees it glowing from the inside. And then as it gets really close, he recognizes there are these humanoid figures in there, but they sure are different from anything I've ever seen. And then it pulls up and stops right in front of him. And you can imagine where Ezekiel went with this. I mean, put yourself in a place, you go out to the park to get some time alone, and all of a sudden this thing comes rushing at you. And here you're standing right in front of these creatures, and you look up and there's the throne of God. By the way, this thing about the chariot throne, this will help us explain. Let's go to, just keep a ribbon here, go to 2 Samuel chapter 22. Now, this also occurs in Psalm 18. But I love here 2 Samuel 22, verse 7. In my distress, I called on Yahweh. I called to my God. He heard my voice out of his temple. My cry came into his ears. So here's God. He's sitting in his temple in heaven. You pray to him. He hears you. He's upset by what's going on in your life. Verse 8, the earth shook and trembled. The foundation of heaven quaked and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils. Fire out of his mouth devoured. Burning coals flamed forth from him. He spread about the heavens and came down. Now, how's he going to come down? It's going to describe this in a second. And now it says, a thick cloud was under his feet. See, I don't believe it's a cloud like you when I think of a cloud. I mean, he's surrounded by this incredibly brilliant white light, which if you're trying to describe that, what are you going to call it? If you've ever seen a cloud that's got the sun shining on it and it's really that bright, bright white, that's what Ezekiel is seeing here. As God is going, and you'll see this if you read through Ezekiel, the glory always goes with him. You rarely see God without being surrounded by some of his glory. That happens, say, for example, in Genesis 18 with Abraham, perhaps Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 3. But loads of times when God shows up, we'll see this a little later in Exodus chapter 19, there's this glory that surrounds him. If you remember when God came into the temple, when God came into the tabernacle was filled with glory. And the ministers had to leave. And when Solomon built the temple and God came into the temple was filled with this, quote, cloud, unquote, with his glory. And the priests had to leave. And that's what's going on here. That this cloud of glory, he's riding it down. Verse 11, he rode on a cherub and flew. Now, this doesn't mean that he jumped on the back of a cherub. The cherubs are carrying his chariot throne, which Ezekiel is describing. So when here's God up in heaven and he's in his temple, he hears your prayer, he gets really upset about it. He really wants to help you out. He whistles for his chariot throne, and it's right there because they move as fast as lightning. He jumps on his chariot throne and says, get down there. And here they come, tearing out of the heavens, and he's going to come to your aid. I mean, this is the picture that's going on here. And then verse 12, look at what it says. He made the darkness around him his canopies. It's not dark. It's brilliant white, but you can't even see into it. So here's the conundrum that the psalmist is in. He's got a picture of this in his mind. God's showing him this by revelation. He's like, how you can't see in it. It's like it's dark. So he's describing it at one place like a brilliant white cloud, and he's describing it in another place like darkness. And we think, well, this doesn't make any sense. But it makes sense if you're seeing it and trying to describe what's going on. So he made this great cloud around him, his canopy, so you couldn't see in it. The gathering of waters, the thick clouds of the skies. Verse 13 again, from the brightness before him. That's really what you're dealing with. Burned forth coals of fire, Yahweh thundered from the heavens, and you get the idea, and he comes down and helps out. But that jumping on his cherub and flying is this thing about this chariot throne. So let's go back to Ezekiel. We're in Ezekiel chapter 1. So this chariot throne has just arrived in front of Ezekiel. I can't even imagine what that experience would be like. Looking at these creatures, looking at this brightness, verse 25, and then a voice came from above the platform that was over their heads when they stopped and they let down their wings. Verse 26, above the platform that was over their heads was the form of a throne of a sapphire stone. Well, now that's interesting, that when God arrives on his platform, on his chariot throne, that the platform of the throne is a blue color like a sapphire. Now, where else do we see that? Let's keep a ribbon here, go to Exodus chapter 24. And then in Exodus, I'll have to go there myself, Exodus chapter 24, 24, we see, God came down on Mount Sinai. And in Exodus 24, verse 10, verse 9, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up. They saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was like a paved work of sapphire stone. Now, what's happened? Well, God jumped on his chariot throne and came charging down to Mount Sinai to meet with Moses. And he's sitting there on his chariot throne. It's a throne on top of this platform, which is blue like sapphire stone. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 19. And Exodus 19 is when Moses arrived. So if you look, let's see, where is this? Exodus 19, verse 18. So the people came out to meet God. Verse 18 says, now Mount Sinai smoked all over because Yahweh descended on it in fire. Well, he's riding down on his chariot throne. Remember Ezekiel, it says fire is coming out from this throne thing. And it says, and its smoke went up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. So again, what Exodus and Psalm 22, Psalm 18, 2 Samuel 22, what these things are doing is they're giving you bits and pieces, and then Ezekiel gives you a much more complete picture of how God travels and what things look like. So back to Ezekiel chapter 1, says, we'll read it again starting in verse 26. Above the platform that was over their heads, the heads of the cherubim, was the form of a throne, as the appearance of a sapphire stone. And on the form of the throne, high up, was a form like the form of a man. And if you follow my teachings, and many of you do, God often shows up in the form of a man, like when he showed up to Abraham, showed up to Samuel, showed up to Jacob, showed up to Solomon twice, in various places. If you want to study that more, go to Acts chapter 7, verse 55, and read the REV commentary. Loads of places God shows up as a man because he wants to be able to relate to his creation, that's you and me. So he says in verse 27, and I saw from the appearance of his waist and upward what looked like gleaming amber, with like the appearance of fire enclosing it all around. Again, this brightness that surrounds God. And from the appearance of his waist downward, I saw what looked like fire. And there was brightness all around him. Verse 28, brightness all around him, like the appearance of a rainbow that is in the cloud on a day of rain. Well, now, wait a minute. Remember Revelation chapter 4, verse 3? Revelation chapter 4, John says in verse 2, I was in the spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and someone was sitting on the throne, and that's God. Verse 3, the one sitting was in appearance like a jasper stone and a carnelian, and there was a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald in appearance, probably not green because it's a rainbow, but an emerald in the sense that it was clear and shiny and sparkling. So we see the rainbow in Ezekiel, we see the rainbow in Revelation. So as we study the throne of God and God appearing through Scripture, he comes on a sapphire blue platform, and he's got this brightness around him, which is multicolored like a rainbow. And it shows up again here in Ezekiel in the book of Revelation. So was the appearances around him. This was the appearance of the form of the glory of Yahweh. And that's exactly right. There's this glory shining around him. And then Ezekiel's next move is completely natural. When I saw it, I fell on my face. I think I'd at least do that, probably more. This thing comes up and parks right in front of you, and then God himself begins to talk to you. He says, I fell on my face and heard the voice of someone speaking. No kidding. That's exactly right. And then verse 1, he said to me, Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. When he spoke to me, the Spirit entered me and set me on my feet, and I heard him who spoke to me. Verse 3, and he said, Son of man, I'm sending you to the children of Israel, to a nation of rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me, even to this very day. Can you imagine hearing that out of the mouth of God himself? Verse 4, the children, meaning the people of Israel, are impudent and stiff-hearted. I'm sending you to them, and you must tell them, this is what Lord Yahweh says. Verse 5, and whether they will hear or whether they will refuse to hear, for they're a rebellious house, yet they will know that there's been a prophet among them. And I love that God sends people and says, whether they hear or not, because that's the position you and I are in. We are charged with the ministry of reconciliation. We've been given the word of reconciliation. We have been assigned to be ambassadors for Christ, and we have a responsibility to speak the word to people. And it doesn't matter whether they hear or not. Whether they hear or not, that's not on us. Whether they hear or not, that's on them. But our job is to speak the word, just like Ezekiel's commission was to speak the word. And I'm going to stop here, but because I think this is, we haven't had the amazing experience that Ezekiel had, getting to see the chariot-throne of God and the cherubim as clearly as he did, and hear the voice of God and get a personal commission from God. But we do have a commission from God, and we do speak in tongues, and we have received revelation. We have, through the gift of Holy Spirit, personal experiences with God. And so, we don't want to ignore or in any way diminish the impact of those things that God has done for us as members of the body of Christ, people with Christ in us, the hope of glory. So I trust this is, as you go back with this information and read this and think about it, and put yourself kind of in Ezekiel's place, the impact of this is truly just amazing and awe-inspiring. And one of the things we get to look forward to in our Christian hope is the personal experience of encountering God at this level. So God bless you, and thank you for being with me tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this little tour into Ezekiel as much as I've enjoyed studying it. And God bless you all.